The cold dawn over Europe felt like the air itself was holding its breath. German generals gathered in a smoke-filled bunker, maps spread wide across the table, their fingers tracing borders with trembling urgency. Reports came in one after another, each more impossible than the last. At first, they laughed.
50,000 tanks.
It was absurd, a rumor meant to shake their resolve. But then photographs arrived, grainy shots of steel convoys rolling through ports, endless lines of machines stretching to the horizon, the stars and stripes painted bold on their sides. One general slammed his fist against the table, veins standing out on his forehead.
This cannot be real. America does not have the industry. He stopped, his words dying as another officer laid down a telegram straight from the front lines.
Entire divisions had already sighted the armored flood cresting Europe's shores. Outside, the roar of engines echoed like thunder, drowning out the defiance still clinging to the room. The ground itself seemed to tremble with each wave of steel crawling closer. The once confident men looked at each other in silence, their war plans unraveling in the face of a force too large to comprehend. And in that bunker, with cigarette smoke curling into the dim light, one whispered what they all feared. The war has already turned. We just didn't see it until now. Engines thundered across the channel like an approaching storm. At first, the German officers thought it was propaganda, some Allied trick meant to rattle morale. But when the low, grinding roar carried across the French coast, even the most skeptical among them grew pale. In Normandy fields, villagers who had lived under occupation for years peeked from shuttered windows as the horizon darkened with steel. American Liberty ships had crossed the Atlantic heavy with cargo, and now their hatches opened to unleash something Europe had never seen. Columns upon columns of tanks, painted with fresh stars, their barrels glinting in the muted sun. Each machine was massive, their sheer numbers overwhelming. Soldiers perched atop them waved down at children, tossed rations and shouted in strange accents. Behind them, long trains of fuel trucks and repair crews kept rolling in, a logistical river that never seemed to end. The villagers whispered in awe, but the occupying German troops who watched from the hedgerows did not whisper. They tightened their grips on rifles, fear coiling in their stomachs. Back in Berlin, a coded message reached the High Command. The generals stood over their maps once more, but this time none dared laugh. The figure was verified.
50,000 tanks.
Entire armored armies, more machines than the Reich had imagined America could even produce in a decade, were now on European soil. One general leaned back slowly, cigarette trembling between his fingers. "We have no defense against this."
Not on this scale. Another spat the words through clenched teeth. Then we are staring at the end. The silence afterward was heavier than the rumble outside. Snow fell in thin sheets over the Ardennes,
but the ground still shook. German infantry, dug into frozen foxholes, felt it long before they saw it. The rumble began as a whisper, then a low growl, and then, like an avalanche breaking loose, it swallowed the forest. A young German private pressed his ear to the frozen dirt. His sergeant barked at him to stay alert, but the boy's wide eyes said more than words. "They're coming." When the first American tank appeared, its outline black against the falling snow, the men muttered prayers. Then another emerged.
And another?
Within minutes, the tree line erupted with hundreds, their treads grinding ice into mud, their barrels swinging like watchful eyes. Word traveled fast. German radios crackled with frantic reports, units screaming for air cover, for reinforcements that no longer existed. The Allies weren't advancing with one armored column, they were advancing with dozens, an ocean of steel. In Berlin, the High Command scrambled. Generals shouted over one another, some demanding counteroffensives, others begging to conserve what little fuel remained.
Maps were smeared with ash from cigarettes crushed too quickly.
One man finally stood, his voice cold. "We built our empire on speed and fear. But now we are the ones who fear, and we cannot outrun this tide." At the front, German soldiers broke ranks. Some fled into the woods, abandoning positions. Others stood rooted, watching as the horizon glowed orange with fire and the endless wave of tanks advanced. The once invincible Reich felt the first cracks of inevitability. The armored tide was not just breaking their defenses, it was breaking their will. Berlin's war rooms were no longer filled with boasting. The air was heavy with sweat, smoke, and silence. The maps that once carried dreams of conquest now showed only red arrows pressing deeper into the heart of Europe, arrows carried by 50,000 American tanks. Reports piled in by the hour, towns flattened, supply lines cut, divisions shattered before they even formed. One general, his eyes sunken from weeks without rest, whispered into the stillness, "We have no fuel left to move. Our panzers are ghosts. What we face is not an army. It is an industry unleashed." In the countryside, German farmers watched the spectacle with mixed hearts. Some wept, afraid of retribution. Others, worn from years of rationing and fear, felt something dangerous stirring, relief. When American tanks rumbled through villages, children dared to wave. Mothers clutched bread rations thrown from passing soldiers, and men stared in silence, their loyalty to the Reich crumbling under the weight of hope. At the front, resistance grew thinner. Entire battalions surrendered without firing. Prisoners, gaunt and trembling, were herded behind the endless columns of Allied armor. One German officer, too proud to yield, lifted his pistol toward his own men. But before he could act, the ground shook so violently that the weapon slipped from his hand. A formation of American Shermans crested the ridge above them, backlit by the burning sky. The officer dropped his weapon, and with it, his belief in victory. By nightfall, Allied spotlights cut through the dark like judgment itself. Villagers described the sound of tanks moving at night as the heartbeat of a new world. The German soldiers who remained in their trenches no longer spoke of counterattacks. They only asked one another how long until Berlin. In the bunker, beneath the chancellery, the word none dared speak began to take form: surrender. The final days came not with one great battle, but with a slow, crushing inevitability. Berlin shook with distant thunder. Though no storm had touched the city, it was the ground itself vibrating with the advance of tanks. Entire avenues trembled, chandeliers swayed in ceilings, and in the silence between each rumble, every German officer knew the Allies were at the gates. Inside the Reich Chancellery, the once proud generals stood hollow. Their uniforms still glittered with medals, but their eyes were grey, emptied of certainty.
Maps no longer mattered. There was nowhere left to maneuver, no reinforcements left to call.
Every corridor echoed with the same unspoken truth. One officer, his voice steady but low, broke the silence. "Gentlemen, we are finished. To order more fighting now is only to murder our own sons." No one argued. In the city streets, civilians huddled in cellars, their ears filled with the iron hymn of American engines. Children clutched rag dolls as the walls trembled. Old women, once forced to raise their hands in salute, now prayed softly, crossing themselves as the rumble grew louder. When the tanks finally appeared, they came not as a wave, but as an avalanche. 50,000 machines spread across the continent moved in synchronized rhythm. The first columns rolled into Berlin's outskirts, their steel bodies scarred but unstoppable. The soldiers atop them stared ahead with quiet determination, knowing they were part of history's turning. German defenders laid down their arms in droves, Some wept. Others simply walked away, shoulders sagging under the weight of surrender. The war had demanded everything from them, but the end took only silence. As dawn broke, American flags fluttered over captured checkpoints, the sound of engines finally softening into stillness. The city was not yet healed, but the war was broken. And in that moment, when the last echoes of resistance faded, the German generals were not shocked anymore. They were silent men, standing in the ruins of their ambition, watching the steel tide that had drowned it. The war was over.